The fluorescent lights flickered over the ICU like a dying pulse. 2,347 hours. Elena Martinez checked the ventilator settings with the kind of precision that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school, muscle memory from operating tents in Kandahar, where a trembling hand meant someone died. She was a ghost on the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 years of keeping her head down, 3 years of letting other nurses take the good assignments, 3 years of no trouble and no questions. The dog tag beneath her scrubs caught the edge of the monitor light as she leaned over the patient in bed 4, adjusted the 4 pump by 1/4 milliliter, and moved on without anyone noticing. No one ever noticed Elena. The charge nurse found her restocking the medication cart in the supply room. Sarah, 19 years at Oak Creek, her voice carrying that particular gravity that meant something was coming. VIP incoming. Air Force Colonel. Critical condition. Sarah didn't look up from her tablet. Multiple traumas, severe internal bleeding. ETA 8 minutes. Elena's hand stopped on the stack of tourniquets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that constant hum like cicadas in summer. She touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs without thinking about it. The chain was broken, held together by a single knot she'd retied 1,000 times. 2 seconds passed. 3. Her voice came out level, deferential, the way she'd trained herself to sound. Which bay? They're setting up Trauma 1. Ashford's coming in personally. Sarah's eyes met hers, and there was something in that look, not pity exactly, but a kind of knowing. He mentioned he wants the unit's best people on this one. Elena nodded once and turned back to the cart. Best people. Ashford had made it clear 18 months ago that Elena Martinez fell into a different category. Just the night shift nurse. The quiet one. The one who didn't ask questions about medication orders and didn't suggest alternative approaches to treatment. The one you called when nobody else was available. She moved through the supply room like she was preparing for combat, which she was, though no one else would have recognized it. Tourniquets in the crash cart. Chest tubes. Surgical clamps. 14-gauge angiocath needles arranged by size. 2 units of fresh frozen plasma already running through the rapid infuser at the bedside. The kind of readiness that came from knowing how much time you had when an artery tore and no amount of panic could slow the bleeding. The supply room smelled like antiseptic and the faint chemical burn of sterilization, a smell that took her back to FOB Shank, Loga Province, where she'd been Major Elena Martinez and the operating tent had been a 12 by 15 canvas space under mortar fire. She pushed the memory down. Elena Martinez worked the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial. That other life, that other rank, that other version of herself, she'd buried that 6,000 miles away and for years in the past. The doors to the trauma bay burst open at 2,351 hours. The sound of that opening, a pneumatic hiss like escaping air from a chest seal, made Elena look up from the monitor she'd been preparing. Dr. Ashford entered first, his pressed slacks and monogrammed shirt a contrast to everyone else's wrinkled scrubs, his presence making the air pressure change like a weather system moving in. He wore confidence the way other people wore cologne. 2 residents trailed behind him, already scribbling notes before they'd even seen the patient. Severe pneumothorax, multiple rib fractures, blunt force trauma to the abdomen. Ashford was already talking, already deciding, his voice filling the room like water finding its level. This case presents significant complexity. We'll need experienced hands. The ambulance team brought the colonel in on a stretcher, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had been broken by something, a vehicle collision, Elena thought, or an explosion. The face was sedated and pale beneath the oxygen mask, but the features were clear enough. Clear enough that Elena recognized him immediately. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of movement no one caught unless they were trained to notice minute changes in a person's composure. No one was. It was him. The officer who'd court-martialed her in Kandahar. The man who'd looked at her testimony about the operation going sideways and decided she was the problem. The man whose decision had ended everything. Major Elena Martinez's career had died in his office on a Thursday, and she'd walked out with a discharge order and instructions to disappear, to never surface, to never speak about Operation Copper Valley to anyone ever again. The military was good at making people vanish. Get him to Trauma 1. Ashford was already moving, already commanding. I want cross-match blood standing by. Type and screen, CBC, CMP, lactate level, fast exam the moment we're set up. And someone page surgery, this one's going to OR inside 20 minutes. Elena moved with everyone else, her movement smooth and practiced, her expression neutral. She'd been trained to keep her face empty during the worst moments. It was the first thing they'd taught her in combat medicine. Your face is the last thing your patient sees, and panic is contagious. Keep it steady. Keep it calm. Keep it like you've seen worse and survived it. The colonel was wheeled into Trauma 1, and she got her first full look at him as they transferred him to the hospital bed. Pale. Blood loss somewhere around 2 units by the look of him. The breathing labored even through the ventilator. His eyes were closed, sedated and unaware, which was good because he wouldn't see her face and recognize it. Wouldn't know that Major Elena Martinez was standing 3 feet from his bed with a 14-gauge needle in her hand, ready to push fluids and hold his life in the balance while he slept. Ashford was calling out vital signs, ordering tests, assigning people to stations like a conductor directing an orchestra. His eyes swept across the room, checked Sarah, checked the residents, checked the monitor, checked the blood workstation, and passed over Elena without actually seeing her. That was fine. That was how it always went. Elena was good at being invisible. I need someone competent on the monitor. Ashford's voice cut across the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. Someone who understands complex cases. Not the night shift staff. The words landed like a blade, precise and cold. Sarah's jaw tightened. One of the residents glanced at Elena, then away. Elena adjusted the flow without changing her expression. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the discipline of someone who'd learned long ago that showing your anger was the same as giving someone a weapon to use against you. She kept working. Monitor settings. Heart rate climbing, 142. Blood pressure dropping, 70/40. Oxygen saturation sitting at 88% and threatening to fall further. The colonel's body was shutting down in real time, and every second was important. Ashford, we need a call to surgery. Elena's voice came out calm, clinical, the way she'd learned to sound when the stakes were highest. Aortic tear, probable. Abdominal distension. He's losing blood faster than we're putting it in. Ashford turned to her, and his eyes went flat. Cold. The kind of look that made it clear he couldn't believe she'd spoken without being spoken to. I'll make the surgical decisions here, not the night shift nurse. He said it quietly, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. And in the future, you'll wait to be asked. The room went silent. Just for a moment. Just long enough for everyone to understand the hierarchy and where Elena sat within it. Then Ashford was turning back to the chart, already calling for the fast ultrasound, and the residents were moving, and Sarah was checking the blood infuser, and Elena was still standing at the bedside with her hand steady and her jaw clenched and her eyes on the monitor where the colonel's heart rate ticked upward like a countdown timer. The phone rang somewhere in the distance. Pages were called. Somewhere in this building, surgeons were being told that a critical case was coming. And Elena Martinez watched the oxygen saturation drop to 82%, then 78%, and thought about the operating tent in Kandahar where she'd learned that sometimes the worst part of saving someone was knowing exactly how much time you didn't have. 16 minutes. Coteen ETA from surgery was 16 minutes. The fluorescent lights flickered over the trauma bay like a dying pulse, and no one in the room knew they were standing next to the one person who might actually be able to save him when everything else failed. The colonel's daughter glanced at her mother, then back at the monitor where his vitals climbed across the screen like a confession, BP dropping, O2 falling, the rhythm of his heart growing irregular. Dr. Ashford stood at the foot of the bed reviewing the chart, his tailored white coat catching the fluorescent glow, the kind of coat that never actually touched patients. Elena pushed the admission cart through the doorway, sterile packets and fresh for supplies stacked in precise rows. Martinez. Ashford didn't look up. This case is too complex for ordinary floor staff. The colonel's family stilled. His daughter's hand found her mother's shoulder. I need someone with more than basic training. Ashford finally glanced over, his eyes the color of winter concrete. This isn't a minor gunshot wound you can slap a bandage on. This requires intellectual capacity for multi-system trauma. He said it slowly, the way someone might speak to a child who didn't understand English. Elena set down the kit. She opened her mouth. One breath. The words were already formed: 12 years of field surgery, 3 tours through Kandahar where she'd worked with surgeons who trained the surgeons training him, a catalogue of trauma cases that would make his hospital rotations look like pediatric wellness checks. She closed her mouth. The colonel's daughter was looking at her now with something that might have been sympathy. Might have been pity. Elena took one measured breath. Just one. In through her nose, slow enough to count to 4, the kind of breathing that soldiers used before rappelling out of Black Hawks into hostile territory. A single tear formed in her left eye, not from fear, not from anger, but from the specific weight of having survived worse than this and still having to smile about it. She let it sit there for exactly 1 second before wiping it away with the back of her hand, her movements precise as a surgical strike. She met Ashford's eyes. I understand you need someone to blame for your insecurity, doctor, but it won't be my patients who pay for it. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath, steady and patient. Ashford's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered at his temple. He turned away first, his fingers tightening on the patient chart until the edges curled. You're off this case, he said to the wall. Immediately. Elena nodded once. She picked up her cart and walked backward out of the room, her eyes still on the colonel's monitor until the doorway erased him from view. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt like it was burning against her chest, the broken chain a weight against her ribs that had nothing to do with physics. The break room at 0200 hours smelled like old coffee and someone's leftover curry from the evening shift, turmeric and garlic clinging to the industrial air like evidence. Elena filled a ceramic mug with black coffee, her hand steady. Muscle memory. She'd poured coffee in tents while mortars landed outside. This was nothing. 3 nurses sat at the far table, Rivera, Chen, and Marks. They were talking about the upcoming scheduling changes, their voices bright and casual. Elena sat down 2 chairs away, setting her mug on the chipped formica. The conversation stopped. Rivera glanced at Chen. Chen grabbed her half-finished cup and stood. Marks followed without a word, as if they'd choreographed it. They moved to the far corner near the vending machines, their voices resuming only after they deliberately put distance between themselves and her chair. One of them whispered. The other laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Elena stared at her reflection in the black coffee. The dog tag chain was visible at her collar where her scrubs gaped slightly, a thin line of silver against her dark shirt, half of a pair that should have had a matching companion. The other one was buried in Arlington under a name that wasn't hers. They'd given her a choice about that, at least. Closed casket or memorial marker. She'd chosen the marker. She drank the coffee without tasting it. 20 minutes later, the unit board outside the ICU stopped her cold. A formal write-up hung directly under the daily assignments, her name highlighted in yellow marker, the kind of yellow that made everything look diseased. The words were printed in clinical Arial font, the language of institutional betrayal, Martinez, overstepping scope of practice. Questioned physician medication order without proper credentials. Documented concern for patient safety does not supersede chain of command. Requires retraining on professional boundaries. Overstepping scope of practice. That was what they called it when you caught a medication order that would have killed the patient. When the resident ordering it was drunk at 0300 hours, not visibly drunk, professionally drunk, the kind where only someone who'd spent 16 years in medical environments could recognize the subtle tremor in the handwriting, the decimal point misplaced by 1 digit that would turn a therapeutic dose into a lethal one. She'd questioned it politely. She'd documented it politely. She'd offered the resident 3 separate opportunities to review the order himself. She'd saved his patient's life. 2 residents read the write-up and looked away when she approached. One of them was Hernandez, the same resident she'd covered for last month when his kid was sick, picking up his overnight shift without complaint. He stared at his shoes. Ashford materialized from the ICU like something conjured by her own anxiety. He walked past her slowly, deliberately slowing his pace. Some people forget their place, Martinez. I'm here to remind them. He smiled the way predators smile before they feed, all teeth, no warmth. Professional standards exist for a reason. Elena's hand moved to her collar. The dog tag chain was still hidden, but she gripped it anyway, feeling the broken edges of the metal bite into her palm. The chain cut deeper. A small line of blood appeared where the edge of the tag pressed into her skin. She didn't move her hand away. Pain was information. Pain was data. Pain was proof that she was still here, still standing, still breathing in an institution that was systematically deciding she didn't belong. She released the tag and watched a tiny red line fade from her palm. The next 36 hours moved like water going down a drain, everything flowing the same direction, everything accelerating toward a single point. She found out about the reassignment through a text from the scheduling office at 0600 hours. Please note, effective immediately, you are reassigned to Pediatric Overflow. Contact Unit Director for updated training materials. Pediatric Overflow. The place where they sent nurses who couldn't cut it in acute care. The place where the cases were straightforward and the decisions were easy and the stakes never climbed higher than a fever that needed monitoring. The place where you couldn't touch the ICU, couldn't access restricted areas, couldn't be anywhere near a complex patient if your life depended on it. Her badge wouldn't scan when she tried to enter the ICU for the morning shift change. The scanner blinked red. Red meant denied. Red meant access revoked. She tried again. Same result. The charge nurse, Michelle, who'd worked beside her for 3 years, who Elena had trained through 2 different charting systems, wouldn't make eye contact. Dr. Ashford restricted your access, she said quietly. It's in the system. You're off his unit effective immediately. Pediatric Overflow starts tomorrow shift. Elena looked through the glass into the ICU. The colonel was in Bay 4, his monitors visible from the hallway. His vitals were deteriorating visibly, BP trending down, O2 sat dropping, the EKG showing irregular rhythms that looked like distress signals in electrical form. His 4 lines had multiplied. There was a second bag hanging now, a clear fluid that could have been anything. What's his condition? Elena asked. Michelle finally glanced at her. Just for a moment. That's not your patient anymore. The apartment was dark when Elena arrived home at 0730 hours. Miguel was already awake, her 17-year-old, the child of a soldier who died before Miguel could form memories, the child Elena had raised alone while hiding half of who she was. He sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, still wearing his debate team sweatshirt from yesterday's competition. You're home early. He looked up, his eyes the same shade as his father's, dark brown with flecks of gold that caught the light like warning signals. Practice cancelled. Schedule change, Elena said. The lie tasted like metal. Shifting to day shift for a while. Miguel studied her for 3 seconds. He was too smart for his own good. He'd inherited that from both of them. You look like somebody died. Elena moved past him to the bedroom closet. Way in the back, behind the winter coats and the boxes of Christmas decorations, was a shadow box, mahogany frame, black velvet backing. She hadn't opened it in 4 years. But her hands knew where it was. Her hands always knew. She pulled it out and looked at it without opening it. Through the glass, she could see the edges, a ribbon edge here, a medal clasp there. A photograph beneath, barely visible in the darkness. Mom. Miguel's voice came from the doorway. What is that? Elena slid the box back into the darkness. Nothing. Just something of your father's. She didn't turn around to see whether Miguel believed her. She knew he didn't. She knew he'd seen exactly what she wanted to keep hidden, and she'd just proven that the hiding wasn't working anymore. That nothing ever stayed buried long enough. That evening, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from resident Hernandez: "Colonel's labs are wrong. Ashford ordered increased anticoagulation. With his aortic tear, that could kill him. I was going to call but I was afraid. I'm sorry." Elena stared at the message until the words stopped making sense, until they were just shapes and light. Anticoagulation. Blood thinner. Intended for patients who needed their blood to flow thinner, to break up clots. Lethal for a patient with an arterial tear. Lethal for a patient whose blood needed to clot, to seal the wound, to stay inside his body instead of pooling out across the floor. She looked at the photograph of her late husband on the mantel, the only one she kept visible, the one Miguel had seen 1,000 times without knowing what to see in it. A man in flight suit, dark hair, eyes that held the weight of decisions no one asked him to make. They'd met during her third tour. They'd married 3 months later in a chapel made of sandbags and prayer. He died 6 months after that in an IED blast that turned his Humvee into scrap metal and his body into something that required a closed casket. The dog tag on the mantel was his. The one she wore was his duplicate. The one buried in Arlington was a ceremonial copy. He'd told her, the night before his last patrol, "Stay hidden. Stay quiet. When this is over, be someone nobody remembers. Be safe. Promise me." She'd promised. Now someone was killing a patient she couldn't reach, and her hands remembered how to save him, and she was running out of time to decide whether promises made to the dead were worth more than lives she could still save. The scheduling office door closed behind Dr. Ashford at 2:14 a.m. Elena didn't see it happen. She was 3 floors down, folding blankets in the pediatric overflow unit that would now be her entire world, but she would learn the details later from Marcus, the night supervisor, who'd been walking past when Ashford emerged holding her file, talking in low careful tones to the unit director about liability concerns and scope creep issues and the need for immediate protective measures. Ashford had done his homework. He knew her weaknesses before he'd ever spoken her name. He'd pulled her personnel file dating back 3 years, read every note, every commendation, every single moment a colleague had written down that she'd done something competent. And then he'd cherry-pick the moments that could be reframed. The time she'd suggested a medication adjustment, now documented as overstepping physician authority. The night she'd caught a dropped central line before infection spread, now recorded as performing a procedure outside her training scope. 16 individual incidents, each one small enough to seem reasonable in isolation, now bound together in a narrative of a dangerous employee who needed to be contained. The unit director had listened. Of course she had. Ashford carried the weight of a man who'd never been told no, who'd made calls to hospital boards before, who had allies in the right offices. He was orchestrating this with the precision of someone trained in institutional warfare. By 2:27 a.m., the decision was made. Elena's reassignment was official. Pediatric overflow. No ICU access. A nurse banished to the ward where nothing critical happened, where she couldn't possibly interfere with his patient anymore. The notification came through the employee portal at 3:12 a.m. Elena was sitting in the break room, the fluorescent hum overhead like insects trapped in glass, when her phone buzzed. She opened the message from HR and read it 3 times, though she understood it perfectly the first time. Reassignment effective immediately. Report to Pediatric Overflow Unit, 2nd floor, for next scheduled shift. Pending completion of orientation and compliance review. Pending. That word was a cage. She set her phone on the table and stared at the message. The systematic nature of it was almost beautiful in its efficiency. He wasn't firing her, that would leave evidence, might trigger legal review. He was simply moving her. Isolating her. Making sure that when something happened to the colonel, and something would happen, because anticoagulation therapy on a patient with severe internal bleeding was a death sentence, Elena would be 3 floors away with no badge access, no clearance, no way to intervene. By the time she understood what was happening, it would be too late. The patient would be dead. Ashford would file a report. The attending physician made an error in judgment. Unfortunate, but not her problem. She was just a floor nurse. Just someone who'd tried to speak above her station. She didn't go home. Instead, she drove to Oak Creek Memorial at 3:36 a.m., pulled into the parking lot facing the building, and killed the engine. The ICU windows were lit from within, third floor, the wing where the colonel lay connected to machines that monitored every beat of his failing heart. Elena sat in the darkness of her car and watched those windows like they were a portal to something she couldn't quite reach. Her badge was still in her pocket, but she knew it wouldn't work anymore. Ashford would have submitted the access revocation the moment he'd filed the reassignment. She'd be locked out. A ghost in her own hospital. Rain began to fall at 4:13 a.m., soft at first, then harder, drumming against the windshield in a rhythm like distant artillery. She watched the ICU entrance, the main doors where ambulances pulled up, the loading dock where supply trucks made their deliveries. Inside, the colonel was probably sleeping, sedated, his body being slowly poisoned by a medication that was supposed to save him. Her phone buzzed at 5:02 a.m. A text from Dr. Patel, the overnight resident, whose contact Elena had added months ago when they'd worked a trauma together. His pressures are dropping. We're seeing some abnormal bleeding from the surgical site. Ashford isn't answering his pages. Elena's jaw clenched. She didn't respond, just watched the message sit on her screen. Another text at 5:41 a.m., this time from Sarah Chen, one of the ICU nurses, someone who'd been kind to Elena before Ashford had made it clear that kindness was a liability. We're really worried about him. The attending won't slow the anticoagulation protocol. We've asked 3 times. Elena stared out at the rain. The windshield had fogged, and she wiped it clear with her sleeve. Inside the hospital, people were scrambling. Inside the hospital, a man was dying because one doctor had decided that ego was more important than evidence. At 6:17 a.m., her phone lit up again. This time it was a call from Marcus, the night supervisor. She let it ring twice before answering. "Elena, we've got a problem." She didn't speak. Just listened to the sound of controlled panic in his voice, the background noise of an ICU in crisis, the soft persistent beeping of monitors that weren't quite alarming but weren't quite right either. "The colonel's bleeding again. Internal. We called for Dr. Ashford 40 minutes ago. He's not responding. Dr. Patel wants to reduce the anticoagulation but she doesn't have the authority to override attending orders," and he stopped. She could hear him breathing, hear the calculation happening on the other end of the line. "I know they reassigned you. But he's asking about you. The family. They want to know if you're still on the case." Elena said nothing. The monitor just alarmed. Marcus continued. "BP's dropping fast. I don't know how much time." The line went to static, then dead sound, then the sound of equipment, voices, the practiced chaos of a medical emergency being managed. She hung up. Elena sat in her car for exactly 90 seconds. She could see the calculation in her own mind with perfect clarity, walk away, and no one could blame her. She'd been reassigned. She had no badge. She had no authority. She had no right. She'd be trespassing. If something went wrong, she'd be liable. If something went right, she'd be a criminal who'd performed unauthorized procedures. There was no universe in which saving this man didn't destroy her. She touched the dog tag hanging under her scrubs. The metal was cold, smooth from 40 years of being worn against skin, scratched from 1,000 moments of survival. Her husband's dog tag. The man who'd made her promise to stay hidden, to bury Major Elena Martinez so deep that even the Pentagon couldn't find her. The man who died believing she would keep that promise. Through the lobby windows, she could see nurses moving. She could see the night shift staff standing up from chairs, moving with purpose. Code team preparation. The kind of movement that meant someone was dying. Elena started the car and drove to the service entrance on the east side of the building. The door required a badge card, but it also required a PIN code for after-hours access. She'd learned that code in her second month at Oak Creek Memorial from a maintenance worker named Frank who'd shown her the backdoor route to the ICU on a night when the front elevators had been down. 3704. The lock clicked open. The hallway was empty. The stairwell was empty. She moved through the hospital like she'd moved through Kandahar forward operating bases, not trying to hide, but not drawing attention either. Just a person who belonged, moving with purpose, moving like she knew exactly where she was supposed to be. The ICU corridor was controlled chaos. Doors open. Staff moving. The monitor from the colonel's room screaming its alarm into the hallway. Flat line. Asystole. No rhythm. No perfusion. No life. Elena walked to the code cart, verified it was stocked, then moved to the nearest supply sink. The water ran cold over her hands. She washed for exactly 90 seconds, not thorough enough for surgery, but what she was about to do wasn't surgery. It was something older. Something that lived in her hands from years that no one here was supposed to know about. She pulled on gloves. The latex snapped against her skin like a trigger being pulled. The code team was already in the room. She could hear them calling orders, could hear the defibrillator charging, could hear the moment they shocked him and he didn't respond. Around the bed, 5 people, then 6, all of them performing the choreography of death denial, all of them preparing for failure because that's what the data said came next. Elena stood in the doorway. No one had noticed her yet. The room was too focused, too committed to its own protocols, too blind to see that what was happening was a simulation. What came next was real. She pulled the trauma shears from the supply cart. The metal felt like memory. The code team continued their compressions. The monitor remained flatline. They'd been doing this for 3 minutes. The colonel's heart wasn't coming back. Not like this. Elena stepped into the room and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of a different uniform, a different life, a different woman entirely. My room. Now. The colonel flatlined at 1843 hours. The overhead page crackled across Oak Creek Memorial like thunder. Code Blue, ICU Bay 4. Code Blue, all personnel respond. Elena was 2 floors down in pediatric overflow when she heard it. Her hands went still. The blood pressure cuff she was adjusting froze mid-motion. She knew that bay. She knew that patient. She knew exactly what was happening and exactly what was about to go wrong. She moved without thinking. The stairwell door swung open before her consciousness caught up. Her legs carried her through the maze of hallways, past the break room where nurses wouldn't look at her, past the unit board where her name hung in highlighted shame, past the security checkpoint where her badge had been deactivated. She walked like someone who belonged everywhere and therefore belonged nowhere. Nobody stopped her. By the time she reached ICU Bay 4, her mind had already mapped the anatomy. Aortic tear. Internal bleeding accelerating. The anticoagulation Ashford had ordered would bleed him dry in minutes. The resident saw her in the doorway. You're not assigned to move. One word. No inflection. The resident stepped aside. The colonel lay on the bed, chest heaving, monitors screaming their descent into chaos. Systolic pressure 62 and falling. Oxygen saturation 71%. The code team was still assembling, 2 nurses pushing the crash cart, an attending from general medicine who had no business running a trauma case, a respiratory tech fumbling with the intubation equipment. Elena assessed in 4 seconds what had taken them 6 minutes to miss. The bleeding wasn't coming from the trauma sites. It was internal. Catastrophic. The aorta was tearing. Not at the entry point. Beyond it. In the descending thoracic segment where they couldn't reach without opening the chest. ETA on cardiothoracic. Her voice was level as a surgical laser. 16 minutes, the charge nurse said. They're in the OR finishing a case. Incoming trauma diverted them from 16 minutes. The colonel had 4. Elena turned to the attending. Step back. He started to protest. She met his eyes. The message was simple and absolute: I am not asking. He stepped back. She moved to the crash cart and retrieved a scalpel. It was lighter than the combat knife she'd carried in Kandahar, thinner blade, surgical steel instead of tactical edge. But her hands recognized the weight anyway. Muscle memory was a living thing. It didn't sleep. It didn't forget. Her fingers curved around the grip exactly the way they had in those operating tents under fire, where she'd held lives together with nothing but steady hands and the knowledge that the difference between living and dying was millimeters and seconds. "Clear the bay," she said to the nurses. Nobody moved. Now. Not a request. A command. They cleared it. Even the attending backed into the corner. The resident stayed frozen by the door, too shocked to leave, too smart to stay in the way. Elena leaned over the colonel's chest. The scalpel was already moving. Sterile field established. She made the incision at the fourth intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the entry point seared into her cellular memory from 100 cases in field medicine stations where there were no surgeons, only desperation and her hands. Blood poured. The resident made a sound, something between a gasp and a prayer. The chest cavity opened. She could see it immediately. The aorta was tearing apart from the inside like fabric being shredded by an invisible hand. Blood was pooling in the pericardial sac. The colonel's heart was drowning. She reached in without hesitation, her fingers finding the bleeder with the kind of precision that only came from having done it before when the alternative was burying someone you'd sworn to protect. She clamped the tear with a vascular clamp, sterile, steady, perfect. The bleeding stopped. 2 units O negative and call cardiothoracic, she said to the charge nurse. Her voice was absolutely level. Tell them I've got temporary hemorrhage control. They're not racing the clock anymore. Who authorized? He was dead in 5 minutes, Elena said, not looking up from the colonel's open chest. Now he's alive. Call cardiothoracic. The attending stared at her. The resident stared at her. The nurses stared at her. She didn't acknowledge any of them. She stood there with her hands inside a man's chest, holding the tear closed with the kind of calm that only exists when you've already looked death in the eye and refused to blink. Muscle memory. Pain is data. Hands that held lives together. The monitors began to stabilize. Blood pressure climbed. 70, 82. 88, O2 saturation rose. The colonel's heart found its rhythm again. Sinus. Beautiful, impossible sinus. She held that clamp for 14 minutes. The surgeons arrived at 18:57 hours, scrubbed and ready, and saw something that made them both stop moving for a full 3 seconds, a night shift nurse with blood soaked to her elbows, standing inside an open chest cavity, holding a vascular clamp with the precision of someone who'd performed 1,000 of these. Not in a hospital. In places where there was no choice. Who authorized this? The attending surgeon asked. Elena stepped back, releasing the clamp to his hands. He was dead. Now he's not. She turned and walked out of the bay. The hallways were blurring now, or maybe that was just her vision narrowing. Tunnel focus. Combat response. She could feel her hands shaking now that they weren't holding anything. Not fear. Restraint. The trembling was restraint. Adrenaline with nowhere to go. She made it to the bathroom and turned the sink on cold, scrubbing the colonel's blood from her arms in silence. The soap was antiseptic and harsh. The water ran red, then pink, then finally clear. By 0900 hours the next morning, Dr. Ashford had made his calls. They must have been beautiful calls, precise, calculated, weaponized with the language of institutional power. He'd pulled her file. He'd documented the unauthorized procedure in language that made it sound like recklessness instead of surgery. Risk management. Legal liability. Scope of practice violations. The hospital board received a memo. Risk management received a memo. By noon, security was waiting for her at the employee entrance. She didn't fight. She didn't explain. She gathered her personal items from her locker, the spare scrubs, the badge that didn't work anymore, the phone that had been off since Kandahar, and walked past the colonel's room one last time. He was sedated, intubated, a breathing tube in his throat and monitors tracking his recovery. Alive. She had kept that promise at least. The one that mattered. That evening, Elena stood alone at her husband's grave in the rain. The ground was muddy, the grass heavy with water, the granite headstone slick with witness. She held the dog tag in her palm. A single dog tag on a broken chain, cold against her skin like evidence of something she'd buried 7 years ago. She knelt in the mud, rain falling like applause, and whispered to the stone, "I tried to stay hidden like you asked, am I a more? I tried. I worked in the shadows and kept my head down and took the insults like a good soldier who knows how to suffer in silence." But he was dying. The colonel. The one who destroyed us. And I couldn't let him die. I couldn't. Even after what he did. Even after the court-martial and the lies and the way you looked at me when they told the Pentagon I was too compromised to keep living. I saw him dying and something broke. Something I'd been holding together for 7 years just cracked open like bad ice. The rain was running down her face now, salt water mixing with rain water, indistinguishable. She pressed the dog tag against her forehead. And now they're going to erase me all over again. Just like they erased Major Elena Martinez. Just like they erased Operation Copper Valley. Just like they're going to erase this moment. By tomorrow, there will be paperwork saying I never existed. That woman who saved his life will be a liability that got terminated for her own good. They'll rewrite it. They always do. I've been disappeared before. I know how it works. You told me it would happen eventually. You said, "Mi amor, you can't run forever. They'll find you or you'll find yourself." Well, I found myself today. And it cost me everything. She knelt there in the mud for another hour, the dog tag cold in her palm, rain hammering the grass like a mercy, like forgetting, like all the ways a person could disappear and the world would simply rearrange itself around the empty space where they used to be. 3 days later, Dr. Ashford stood outside Oak Creek Memorial with 4 camera crews positioned like sentries, the morning sun burning off Jacksonville humidity. He wore his white coat like armor, crisp, starched, untouchable. The press conference had been his idea. A controlled narrative. His chance to frame the story before it spiraled. He'd already prepared the language: dangerous rogue operator, unauthorized procedures, threat to patient safety. He would sound concerned. Measured. Professional. The cameras rolled. "I have a responsibility to this hospital and to patient safety," Ashford said, his voice carrying the careful cadence of rehearsal. "What occurred in our ICU was a breach of protocol so severe it endangered lives. I cannot in good conscience allow someone with such questionable judgment to continue practicing medicine here." Major Martinez, or whatever her credentials actually are, performed a thoracotomy without surgical clearance, without anesthesia consultation, without any authorization whatsoever. She is not a surgeon. She is not qualified. And she will be terminated immediately. He paused. Let the cameras drink in his concern, his moral authority. This is about protecting patients. That's all I've ever wanted. The lie hung in the humid air like exhaust. One reporter raised her hand. "Dr. Ashford, are you saying she saved Colonel Hayes's life illegally?" "I'm saying she risked his life," Ashford corrected, smooth as oil. A trained cardiothoracic surgeon was minutes away. She had no business. The crowd shifted. A young man pushed through the camera lines. Dark hair, Elena's eyes, her jawline. Miguel Martinez was 17 and he was carrying something that looked like a shadow box, the kind that holds military medals. His voice cracked as he moved toward his mother's executioner. "Mom, they need to see these." The charge nurse, Rebecca, who'd left coffee cups untouched when Elena sat in the break room, took the frame with trembling hands. Her eyes widened. She turned it toward the camera so the morning light could catch the medals, could make them gleam like warnings. "Major," she read aloud, her voice shaking. "Elena Martinez." A silver star caught the light first. Then 2 bronze stars with Valor. Then a purple heart, and another. The frame held not just medals but a photograph, a woman in desert fatigues, a call sign patch visible on her shoulder, standing with a team of operators whose bearing said everything about who they were. "That's not possible," Ashford whispered. The color drained from his face like someone had opened a valve. A man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Tall, built like someone who'd spent decades converting pain into muscle. His shirt collar was open just enough to see the SEAL trident tattooed over his heart. "I'm Lieutenant Commander James Holloway, Naval Special Warfare Command," he said, his voice carrying the weight of classified ops and things civilians weren't cleared to know. "I served with Major Martinez in Kandahar. She saved 14 lives in a single operation. That included a senator's son who would have died if she hadn't performed exactly the kind of emergency surgery you're calling reckless. She had more combat medicine training than most trauma surgeons." The camera swiveled. Ashford's shoulders tensed like a man who'd just realized the ground had shifted beneath him. An FBI liaison emerged from the growing crowd, credentials visible, her voice cutting through the Jacksonville humidity with federal authority. "Major Elena Martinez's military record was classified under Operation Copper Valley," she said. "Sealed. Off books. When this hospital admitted her 6 months ago under her civilian name, those records remain sealed per her request and per federal designation. Dr. Ashford, you accessed a flagged VA record 3 weeks ago. You knew. And you chose to target her anyway." Silence. The kind that happens when a man realizes he's been filmed destroying his own career in 4K resolution. An older voice came through a phone being held up, a retired general calling into the live broadcast, the kind of person who'd commanded armies and whose word moved mountains. "Dr. Ashford, I have documentation showing you knew about Major Martinez's background," the general said, his voice steady as granite. "You accessed her sealed file on March 14th. You read that she was a decorated officer. And you spent the next 17 days systematically isolating her, reassigning her, removing her access to patients, and filing false complaints. You tried to destroy a woman's second chance because your ego couldn't accept being questioned by someone smarter than you. That's not patient safety. That's spite." The cameras didn't know where to point anymore. Ashford was the story now. Ashford was the reckoning. His face had gone the color of old hospital walls, a gray that said everything about what happened when power met consequence. "I was protecting," he started. "You were protecting nothing," the general interrupted. "You were protecting yourself. And you failed." Within an hour, the footage had 6 million views. By evening, 12 million. Social media erupted in hashtags, #Major Martinez trending nationwide. Medical boards were fielding calls. Ashford's private practice was getting cancellations by the dozen. His attorney called him into a conference room at 3 in the afternoon. "Resign," the attorney said, showing him the video where a Navy SEAL confirmed Elena had saved lives in ways that mattered more than administrative protocol. "Resign today, or the hospital refers you for ethics violations. You lose your license. Maybe you face criminal charges for accessing classified records." "I was trying to." "I know what you were trying," the attorney cut him off. "Stop. You're done here." Ashford had no response that didn't implicate him further. He signed papers at 5 o'clock. His hospital privileges were suspended pending investigation. By 6, he was gathering his things from an office that suddenly felt like a museum of his own failure. By 7, his name was being removed from the hospital directory. 2 weeks later, inside Oak Creek Memorial's ICU, a man opened his eyes. The colonel. Fully awake. Fully conscious. The ventilator had been removed days ago. His body was healing with the stubborn precision of a military mind determined to survive. Elena adjusted his for drip with steady hands. Checked his monitor. Noted his vitals. Worked with the quiet competence of someone who'd been doing this across a career that spanned from combat tents to intensive care units. He stared at her. Recognition flooded his eyes like a storm system moving across open water. "Major Martinez," he whispered. She didn't turn. Didn't flinch. Just continued her work. "Kandahar," he said, his voice breaking. "I court-martialed you. I ended your career. I made a decision that you needed rest, Colonel," Elena said, adjusting the fore-drip with a kind of precision that comes from knowing exactly how to keep someone alive. She pulled the dog tag from beneath her scrubs. Held it where he could see it, worn silver on a broken chain, inscribed with a name she'd carried for 16 years. "That's what patients do. They rest." She met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "You saved my life," he said. "I saved a patient," Elena replied. "That's what I do." She turned back to the monitors. The colonel closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his face, the kind that comes from finally understanding what you'd been too proud to see when you held the power to destroy it. 6 months later, Elena and Miguel walked past a strip mall in Jacksonville on a Wednesday afternoon. She was heading toward her shift at Oak Creek Memorial, her ICU badge clipped to her scrubs. Miguel was heading to community college, carrying a textbook on emergency medicine. Miguel pointed. Between a nail salon and a vape shop, at a folding table with a hand-scrawled sign, "Supplemental Health Coverage," sat Dr. Ashford. His polo shirt had the insurance company logo stitched on the chest. His face had lost that polished arrogance. An elderly woman took his flyer and walked away without reading it. He looked up. Saw Elena. Looked away first. "Don't," Elena said quietly to her son. "He's just a man who learned the hard way that power is borrowed, not earned." They kept walking. Back inside Oak Creek Memorial, Elena led morning rounds. A team of residents followed her like she was holding something they needed to learn: how to make decisions under pressure, how to read a patient's body the way some people read books, how to stay steady when everything around you is burning. The charge nurse asked her opinion on a complex case. Elena gave it. A new hospitalist adjusted orders accordingly. No one questioned her anymore. Everyone listened. The colonel visited 2 weeks later, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a folder that looked official. "I petitioned the Air Force Review Board," he said. "Your court-martial has been vacated. Full honorable discharge reinstated. Back pay authorized." Elena took the folder. Opened it. Read. The words didn't change anything she already knew about herself. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you showed me what honor actually looks like," the colonel said. "And I owed you the truth." Elena closed the folder. Handed it back. "The truth is, I stopped needing your approval the day I chose to save you anyway," she said. "Keep it." She returned to her patient. Adjusted monitors. Checked lines. Worked. That evening, Elena sat at her kitchen table with Miguel, teaching him how to tie a proper tourniquet. The shadow box with her medals hung on the wall now, gleaming in the kitchen light. A new photograph hung beside it, Elena in her scrubs, surrounded by her ICU team, all of them looking at the camera like they'd just survived something and were grateful for it. "What made you go back that night?" Miguel asked. Elena touched the dog tag. "Your father taught me that some promises matter more than others," she said. "I promised him I'd stay hidden. But I promised myself I'd never stop being who I am. And those two promises collided. I had to choose. So I chose the one that let me sleep at night." She looked at her son. "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." Miguel smiled, the kind that said he understood now. That his mother had never been the woman Dr. Ashford tried to make her. That heroes don't need permission. They don't need validation. They just need one moment when no one's watching and they do what they know is right. If you made it this far, you already know the truth, the quiet ones, the ones who ask no credit, the ones who bleed in private, they're the ones changing the world. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story about the people nobody sees coming. Drop a comment telling us who you'd want in your corner when everything falls apart. That's all for now.